Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Brothers and sisters, Jazakallah for joining us for tonight's halqa. Sorry for the slight delay. Brother Nazir will be presenting the halqa, and the topic will be gender equality from a Quranic perspective. Nazir, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me? Osman, can you hear me? I'm not too sure if y'all can hear me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Nazir, you are a bit faint.
Okay, just give me a minute. There's something wrong
Right.
with my... 1 minute, eh?
Okay.
I don't know why my earpiece has stopped working. Is it a bit better now?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. Let me just share screen 1 second. Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The topic I'll cover tonight is gender equality, or rather gender equity, a Quranic perspective. And apologies, it's a fairly brief presentation and I've borrowed from some online material, so it's not a fully comprehensive presentation. So Sadiq, thanks for letting me know yesterday. So I've put together just a few core aspects I think that's important to cover. So just brief in background, if we look at, we're talking of gender, we're talking of males and females. And globally, there's roughly about equal proportions of males and females. Geographically, it varies sometimes, like Cape Town has slightly more females, but on average, it's a similar proportion. And of the 7.6 billion people on the planet Earth, just about half of those are females. And I think what the reality check is that males are by definition offspring of the females, right? And in terms of when we're looking at the gender differences, what the Quran makes clear in Surah 4 verse 1 is that we all come from a sort of a common ancestral origin. As Allah describes a nafsin wahida. So, O mankind, reverence your guardian Lord who created you from a single person, creator of like its nature, his mate, and from them twain scattered like seeds, countless men and women. Reverence Allah through whom you demand your mutual rights, and reverence the wombs that bore you, for Allah ever watches over you. So that term single person is actually nafs wahida. From the singularity was formed man and woman. When we come to issues around gender equality, there's numerous verses that talk of sort of what's equality between the male and female genders. So in Surah 4, verse 124, Allah says, if any do deeds of righteousness, be they male or female, and they have iman, they will enter heaven, and not the least injustice will be done to them. So very neutral in perspective. Surah 33, Surah Ahzab, verse 35, sort of, mentions Muslim men and women, believing men and women, devout men and women. And actually in Arabic, it's like Muslim men and Muslim women, believing men and believing women, almost like an equality of statement, right? Humble men, humble women, charitable men, charitable women, etc. So highlighting from a divine perspective that they sort of, in the eyes of Allah, are seen equally. And in verse Surah 48, verse 5, similarly, that they will both enter Jannah. There's no special differences as such. And in verse Surah 4, verse 32, Allah says, in no wise be jealous of those things which Allah has bestowed His gifts more freely on some of you than on others. To men it is allotted what they earn, and to women what they earn. But ask Allah of His bounty, for Allah has full knowledge of all things. So again, this verse makes it quite stark that it's women have sort of equal rights at earning than as men do. And also in Surah 24 verse 12, this is like the slander of Aisha. And it says, why did not the believers, men and women, when they heard of the affair, put the best construction on it in their own minds and say this charge is an obvious lie? What I put here, the reason I put this verse also, it highlights that the responsibility aspect. So it's also they're equally responsible for taking a stance on certain issues as well. All right. So these verses, and there's a lot of verses that sort of speak to this neutrality in terms of in the sight of Allah. Then there are things that we also need to appreciate. And in I don't know where I missed the verse. Sorry, 1 second. No. In this verse, okay, Surah 3 verse 36. Apologies. This is in the story of Maryam when she gave birth. Sorry, not Maryam, the mother of Maryam. And she gave birth to this child. It says in Surah 3 verse 36, when she was delivered, she said, "Oh my Lord, behold, I am delivered of a female child, and Allah knows best what she brought forth. And no wise is a male like the female. I have named her Maryam, and commend her and her offspring to your protection from the evil one, the rejected." It's a very clear statement that in no wise is a male like a female. And it's quite clear, at least biologically, that there are differences. So obviously, women give birth, men don't. There are obviously hormonal cycles which play an important physiological role, and that also leads to some physical differences. I mean, when we talk of these differences, I mean, there might be some women that are stronger than men, but we're talking at a sort of a population level, right? And not at individual levels. So there are clearly differences. There are also differences in social perception. So in Surah 16, verse 58, we see the reaction of the people of the Quraysh community. And verse 58 says, when news is brought to one of them of the birth of a female child, his face darkens and he is filled with inward grief. So there are certain social and cultural perceptions around females, and we know in at least historic times, in terms of the ancient Arab culture, they used to bury their female children alive. So these are quite serious negative perceptions on females. And what's interesting is when I was just looking at the data on, I mentioned 101 males to 100 females, but certain parts of Asia and Africa, that doesn't hold true. And there is suspicion that there might be some biases towards male children and infanticide, or female infanticide that still continues or has impacted on the history of our population in time. So there are these issues, and I think this is important to appreciate when we're talking of gender differences. One is around negative perceptual aspects. And verse 36, the one that I mentioned earlier, even the mother of Maryam was surprised. She dedicated this being in her stomach, in her womb, to the service of Allah, and she's given a female. And in her own surprise, she's wondering why she's given a female when she's expecting a male. So these are cultural norms as well that that we need to also recognize when talking about gender differences. The two verses I'd like to touch on in terms of, so there are differences, but some of these differences are real, some of these are perceptual differences. And sometimes some verses of the Quran can sometimes be distorted to give a negative perception, but sometimes there's a real difference that the Quran speaks of. And I think we need to separate those two. So what I'm going to cover is these two verses that are sort of points of clarification in terms of translation. And I've taken this from Joseph Islam's note. So I think we're very familiar with this verse in Surah 64, verse 14, where Allah says, "Oh, you believe, indeed among your wives and your children, there are enemies for you. Therefore beware of them. And if you pardon, overlook, and forgive, then indeed Allah is forgiving, most merciful." So here the common translation is among your wives, azwajikum. And he makes a good point. He says that the term azwaj is genitive, masculine, plural noun in this case. And azwaj doesn't necessarily mean wife, it actually means spouse. And what's even clearer is kum, it's not kunna. So it's a possessive pronoun. And highlighting that, Allah is warning us not that there are enemies among our wives, but there are enemies among our spouses. And that's a subtle difference. But we know that sometimes a goodly woman, like the story of Fir'aun, his wife was a great woman, but yet the spouse, the male, was an enemy as such. So I think that's just important to appreciate. And then this one on, this perception around women should be fixed at home. However, we know there's a need for women in society as doctors, nurses, teachers, dais, a lot of other things. We even seen the example of the Queen of Sheba, where she was actually a leader of a community. So they do serve important social roles. And he quotes this verse, which is quite interesting, Surah 66, verse 5, relating to the wives of the Prophet. It may happen that his Lord, if he divorced you, will give him instead wives better than you, submissive to Allah, believing, pious, penitent, devout, inclined to fasting, widows and maids or maidens, right? And the term sa'ihatin is translated as fasting. And what's interesting is that there are the verses that talk, or which uses the word som in a feminine form of fasting men and fasting women. But in this specific one, sa'ihatin actually means to travel, to journey, or to tour, and really speaks about one who wanders in travel through the land. And I didn't put it on the screen, so let me just get to it quickly. Surah 9, verse 112 is quite interesting, where we can see the occurrence of the same, which even 9, I think I got typing wrong here. Yeah, I think the verse is incorrect. Okay, I might have copied it wrong. But it talks of those traveling in journey, where it talks of sa'ihatin. You can just look at Joseph Islam's note. I think I've copied, made a mistake on that copying. But what's striking about this ayah is that Allah is talking of the pious, the penitent, the devout, and the travelers, or those who journey out, referring to the wives of the Prophet. So it does, on one hand, it's sort of describing a community of people that would go out, obviously for reasons justified, right? And then when we look at Surah 33, which is the most commonly cited verse that we know of when we think of restrictions on women, this verse is Qarna fi buyutikum. Stay in your homes and do not display your finery as women used to do in the days of Jahiliyyah. He talks of zakah and salah, and Allah talks of removing the uncleanliness from you. So this is in reference to the Ahl al-Bayt, the household of the Prophet ﷺ. But also the word qarara, qaf ra ra, doesn't necessarily mean purely to stay in one's home. It means to be quiet, to be steadfast, firm, refreshed, stable. There's quite a few other occurrences when Allah talks of the seed that's planted in the womb, that's qarara. When Allah describes us on earth, it talks of qarara. Not qarara, qarana. I think it sounds spelled wrong. So they all sort of talk of some sense of stability and safe lodging. So it doesn't mean to be restricted in one's home, otherwise it will be a contradiction on the verse above. At least this is the argument that Joseph Islam puts forward. So I think just to summarize this point is that these two verses indicate that women actually encouraged sort of to go out, and on the other hand, homes still represent an important stability and safe lodging. There are obviously duties and responsibilities that are there, but it's not stay as in don't leave. I think that's the point, right? So rather reside as such. So those are the two that I think are points of clarification around how the words wife or spouse, and then the issue around forcing women to remain at home. Then the second two topics, and I've chosen these because I think it's it's useful to discuss these. They're controversial and sometimes not very easy to answer, but worth a discussion, at least from a Halqa perspective. So I've chosen just these two that are controversial now. And the one is the issue, can women lead a mixed congregation? And then the second question is, are two female witnesses, is it true that two female witnesses equals to one male witness? So those are the two topics, and I'll just briefly cover, and this also is from Joseph's notes. So the first one around, can a woman lead mixed congregations? So I think what we can just state as fact is that, sorry, I tell you, I did this in a rush. The prophets in the Quran were all male. All right, let me fix it now. Yeah, so I think that's quite categorical. Look at Musa, Yunus, look at Yusuf alayhi salam, all male prophets that are referred to. The two females that are sort of given a very high rank, the wife of Fir'aun, as she's described as the wife of, and the second is Maryam. And in Surah 3, verse 42, Allah describes Maryam as being chosen over all other women. So it's interesting, Allah's choice of words. And then the second, the next verse, Allah says, instructs Maryam, bow with those that bow. So there is some subtle hints towards them not necessarily taking a religious leadership position. The second is the case of the Queen of Sheba, which is slightly different again. So this was a sort of non-Muslim at one point. She was a leader, and Sulaiman sought to bring her to the truth. If we read in Surah 27, verse 31. And finally, at the end of the story, she submits with Sulaiman to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what's interesting is there's no mention of whether she remains the leader or not. But what's quite interesting is that it's almost regarded as an irrelevant point because she's come to the truth. And I mean, it's a point of discussion for us. So if you look at the first two bullet points, it doesn't seem like there's encouragement for females to be leaders. But we're given the example of the Queen of Sheba. And she was sort of a balanced leader, as you can see from the story. And even if I just think of in the contemporary times, the president of New Zealand comes out as a very stark, good leader, right? Reminds you almost of the Queen of Sheba kind of story of a very righteous person who stands for truth and is willing to side with the truth when they see it. So a point of debate. I mean, it's not a strong encouragement, but it's not a strong negation as such. So there's a few points that we can take out of this. So few considerations is that difficulties may arise when you're managing men in congregations and disputes in congregations. So while it might not be not allowed for a woman to lead, but it might not be the best solution for a specific task. And I think it will be task-based. And it doesn't mean that the women are inferior by not being leaders of a congregation for that matter, but might not be the most appropriate. The second, I suppose, is issues around women and expecting mothers, but then again, you think of this Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, and I mean, obviously she had to go for her maternity leave. So those are considerations that need to be taken into account. And it doesn't negate them from social responsibility, but more around the issue of accommodating them through this process, accepting the differences. So I think what he points out is that the Quran neither instructs nor prohibits women leading prayer explicitly. However, narratives may imply a lean towards favoring men in this capacity of a religious leadership role within a given community. This wisdom needs to be understood and not skirted. At least that's his perception and explanation on this issue. Then the controversial one is the issue around the two witnesses. So the longest verse in the Quran is Surah 2, verse 282. And it's quite explicit that, it talks of bring two male witnesses, and if not, then one male and two female. It's a very categoric, clear-cut statement. And that's why I separated the issues around points of clarification and controversial, but technically it's factual. The Quran refers to this as 2 to 1. But I think when you look at it more closely, then it becomes clearer why this is the case. So to the first, what's important to appreciate is that it's quite limited to Surah 2, verse 282. It deals with financial issues and financial transactions specifically, and evidence related to that. So if you look at the issues around lewdness and evidence, there's no requirement for, bring four witnesses, in the evidence of lewdness. It could be male or female. There's no differentiation Allah makes in that. So it's a clear one-to-one. So the question comes up is, why is it specific for that transaction, but not in other cases where this difference occurs? So I think a few points to note around financial responsibility. It seems to be quite shouldered by men from the Quranic perspective. So if you look at the laws of, apologies, I've been typing quite rapidly. So it's 411, 12, and 176. So inheritance laws, the issues around dawah, put responsibility on men. If you look at the support for a child after divorce, provision for divorced woman or widow, general maintenance, instead of 4 verse 34, bima anfaqahum min amwalihim. So again, responsibility of men to do financial provision. And then if you look at Surah 5 verse 106, I think we dealt it with the bequest topic. It talks of, bring two male witnesses when the bequest is being made. So it's interesting that these verses mention these things related to finances. Some argue that this is because, at least historically, women were excluded from the financial systems, but it might be different today, although the Quran is meant to be a book for eternity. Right. So then the question comes up is, what is the rationale or wisdom for this 2 to 1? So maybe even before getting to that point, I think is just to clarify that it's not necessarily two female witnesses to one male witness. So it's important to appreciate that the one is sort of what we call a primary witness, and the second is there as a supporting role. So only if the first cannot provide sufficient testimony to that witnessing the transaction would the second one come into the picture. If the first witness, the female witness, the primary witness, is able to clearly give her testimony, then it suffices against the witness of one male. And you read the verses, it's quite categoric, right? So this is from another site. He explained it kind of similarly. I like the way he put it across. So there's a primary and assistant witness, and he talks of Anta Dilla if she forgets Ihdahuma, one of the two. Let's call her Aisha. Fatuzakira, she may remind. Ihdahumul Ukhra, the other one among the two. Let's call her Maryam. In essence, the phrase is saying if Aisha forgets, Maryam may remind her. And this person goes on to justify that there are differences in memory between men and women, etc. And there does seem to be some things that women tend to remember better and some things that men tend to remember better. And the explanation here is that in financial transactions, it may be that a female may be best positioned to support another female in this kind of situation. I think there is evidence that there's differences in memory between men and women. But I mean, I don't think that's completely justified, to be honest. If I think of a lot of females are in the accounting profession and actually do a fantastic job by and large. And I don't think there's any deficiencies in their memory per se, in terms of financial transactions for that matter. But I'll go to the next slide and give you my perception on how I think this verse is understood. But I think the last point that they make here is the assistant witness, and which is quite useful, is that they put it, the way he explained it, is in the face of patriarchy and taking account of the social culture, providing a support so that women could be empowered, so that she does not fear to represent the truth in court, which makes a lot more sense in terms of the way the verse is constructed. So this is more or less my second last slide. So just on this, the specific verse around, called two males or male and two females, and it says if they want tadilla, then the other one can tadhakkara. And when I looked at the verses, when the word from dalal, it means to lose one's way, to go slightly off track, to go on a tangent, etc. And then the word tadhakkara, from the word dhikr. And I've been trying to fathom, like dhikr, we often think of, we understand dhikr, but when you look at the word dhikr, it seems to, if you look at most of the way Yusuf Ali translates it when it's tadhakkaru, it is to admonish. But when you look at it more closely, it is almost Allah saying tadhakkaru, to bring to your attention or to alert you. And as I mentioned, Yusuf Ali often use the word admonish, right? And when I looked at it, it doesn't, the first important point I think that comes out of here, it's not the word nasiya is not used. It's not that she forgets, as the previous slide spoke about. It's more about the first female witness losing one's way, or going slightly off track, or going on a tangent. And the second one, not reminding, but Paul bringing to her attention, and sort of supporting her and going back to the primary focus. And then I've read around a little bit on this topic, and so what's interesting is there's a psychology of a courtroom and giving evidence, right? It's quite a male-dominated, at least historically, and there's a lot of pressure in those circumstances. And then there is some evidence around differences in memory, as I mentioned. So there's one study more recent has highlighted that women had a greater advantage when verbal processes could be used for remembering, whereas men were at an advantage with information based on more spatial processing. So, it's sequence and order is more what the spatial processing is talking about. Whereas the verbal processing involves a conglomerate of different issues that emerge and sort of comes together. But what was interesting is the second one I've mentioned here is that the study, at least this person had done and looked at gender differences in, at least this was criminal investigations and serving as a witness. And what she observed is that female eyewitnesses provided longer descriptions. And if you think of it, generally women do sort of give a lot more detail. I mean, men are very abrupt and sometimes lack of any emotion as well. And maybe what the word tadilla and tadhakkara and the second assistant is really meant to be is, obviously a courtroom is a very focused place. They don't want you to be going off tangent or going on off track. And they want you to be brief and to the point. And I suppose the one other thing that I was wondering about was often women may have a more emotional aspect to testifying. And they might have more consciousness around, maybe a person's future earnings, etc. And men can be sometimes crude and abrupt. And maybe this one here is sort of keeping an assistant to help her not divert, but also not getting diverted by emotion or feelings, but sticking to the facts. And when we look at it in summary, it really, the way I see that the 2-to-1 is, number one, it's a primary female witness, and the second is there as an assistant. And the primary purpose for it is to provide certainty for justice, so it removes any potential risk. It provides advantages to women in the pursuit of truth. And technically does not lower the value of a single female witness. If she's confident and gives a clear answer, then the second person is female is irrelevant. But if she needs that support, then she has that. And it's almost like providing a future-proof system to protect women in a sort of a male-dominated society, which even in 2020 is still a problem. Right, so I'm going to end off here. In summary, I think in terms of gender balance, in the sight of Allah and in terms of one's final reward, there are no differences between males and females. Women have rights and responsibilities that are guaranteed in the Quran, and these are numerous. I've highlighted them. There are obviously negative perceptions of women, and that stems primarily from a patriarchal society. And we've seen like the infanticides related to females. There are certain undue restrictions placed on women, and these are not justified and often misinterpretation of the verses. We also need to appreciate that there are clear differences as well, physical differences, biological differences, and often differences in terms of roles and responsibilities in society. And it's important that we need to serve the best interest overall. And the two topics that are highlighted as differences where these special consideration is needed is related to leadership and efforts in terms of efforts towards justice, and specifically financial justice. So we need to apply our minds and see the wisdom of the Quran from that perspective. And lastly, I think what is often underappreciated when you're looking at the 2 points above is that the Quran is aimed at facilitating the inclusion of women in society, and this is strongly encouraged, and also provides some degree of protection from women from male-dominated societies as such. And then if anyone's interested, most of this is from Joseph's articles, and then there's one other website I looked at in terms of the male to female witnesses. Right, so I'll stop there. Jazakallah.
Okay, Nazir, Jazakallah. Interesting presentation, lots to think about. So I'm going to encourage you to please raise your hands so I can take those whose hands are raised first. Being a gender equality presentation, I'm going to give preference to the ladies tonight. So if there are any women with their hand up, you're going to go first, so I don't leave you for last. So please raise your hands. It just makes it easier to facilitate the presentation. Oh, sorry, the questions and answers. So you know, but you all know how to use the functionality on Zoom of raising hands.
Yeah, and just to echo what Osman has said, I think it's important that we hear the female voices today. I mean, it's about gender, and I mean, it'll be good to hear women's perspectives on this topic, which need to be sounded out.
So let me do this. I'm gonna go to my screen and see whoever's I can recognize as a female name on the Zoom participation. I'm gonna ask you first, right? So let's go down here. Farhana, I see you first. Sorry. Okay. Farhana, go for it.
Jazakallah for the good presentation, but I have no questions.
Okay. Okay, Farah, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Any questions, comments?
No questions, just a comment. There's a lot to learn from the Sunnah as well about the role of women in Islam. For example, Khadija radiallahu anha, Aisha radiallahu anha, and their contributions in the way they lived their lives. We can take a lot of lessons from their examples in terms of what women in the community should be able to and should be allowed to fulfill their roles in terms of that.
Okay, Nazir, any comment?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good point. I mean, you know, what you find in the wives of the Prophet, I mean, they would often accompany him into battles and serve as nurses. They served as sort of sources of knowledge. And, you know, the verse that I mentioned about, you know, the one about them traveling, Sa'ihat, and then the other one about Karna fi buyutikum, goes in a very stark contrast with the exclusive perspective around women should only stay in their homes. So I agree with Farah. I mean, there's good examples in the Sunnah. Obviously, they need to be respectable. If you look at Surah 33, verse 33 as well, it's about not, you know, going out as a dazzling display, but for serving community needs. And I mean, you know, there's a lot out in the community. Even teachers, for example, are important for our community, for children, and they women often serve an important role in that sphere as well. Yeah.
Okay, Jazakallah. Dr. Nazir. Fazana, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Any questions, comments?
No questions. Jazakallah.
Okay, Jazakallah.
Okay, just to
Fine,
point
let's
out,
go.
everyone, Fazana is an accountant. She does a very good job.
Right, good. Rafiq, I'm sure Sadia is here with you, so we want to hear Sadia's question or comment.
Okay, you can come back maybe a little later, Oshi.
Okay, okay. Right. Next person, Sumaya. Sumaya, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Any question, comment?
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
I just wanted to ask about, I don't know if it's relevant, the word hur in the Quran. Is that a neutral word or is that a feminine word? And you know, we always hear about men getting hurs in Jannah. So I just wanted to know your view on that.
Clearing our honors next. Okay, Jazakallah. Nazir,
Yeah.
what word?
Good question. So what's interesting is the word hur is actually a masculine feminine word. And what's also interesting is, you know, we've heard of the Hawariyun, the disciples of Isa. It comes from the same word, hur. So I think it's again that same issue around like Zawj and a spouse. It really speaks of like the Hawariyun were sort of this white-robed, righteous people. And I think that the hur just, when you're looking at the verses related to they will be granted hurs really implies almost like your white-robed kind of people when you think of the Hawari. And when you compare that with the other verses, Allah says you will be joined with the righteous among your spouses, your children, etc. So it's very clear that the hur being referred to is actually your righteous spouses. And these 99 virgins and all of that Maulanas have sold to us.
And so it's not a feminine noun, am I right?
No, it's a masculine actually.
Oh, okay.
And that's why the Hawariyun is actually not changed in gender. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Sumaya, you can use the Arabic corpus as well. You'll find the Hawariyun, and all these occurrences. Just find one of the references, and you pick them all up. So I think I'll try to post it later as we're going through the presentation. It's very interesting. let's move on.
Okay.
Are you okay?
Yep.
Right. Okay. So please, everyone else, raise your hands so we know. I know the questions, and I can go to those whose hands are raised first. I don't see raised hands here. Let me go. Sadiq, any question?
Nothing.
Okay. Rian?
Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum salam.
How are you, Nazir?
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Ray. How's it, man?
Alhamdulillah, yourself.
Good.
Okay, you know the several verses in Quran refer to maidens pure and rich, similar to what the previous question was. But we heard a talk a while back from, I can't remember if the lady was from the UK or something, but she made it clear that that doesn't specifically refer to women only, because it's for spouses. So when you use the category of spouses, then it covers men and women. So I don't know if you can clarify a bit on that, because the Quran, wherever you look at it, refers many places about what believing men and are promised, like, you know, like the maidens, pure, rich and pure, and like what you pointed out now.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to think. I mean, and I think that's a general issue, right? In terms of how we, so the Quran is written in a sort of a male form, right? That's the
In
male.
a masculine gender type of.
Yeah, and I think what's important to appreciate. So Allah sometimes makes a specific note of like the Muslim men and Muslim women, more from an emphasis point of view, but the generality of like you know, the word is zawj or azwaj often in these
Right.
verses. And like I highlighted in that same verse, you know, among your wives are enemies. It's actually among your spouses are enemies. Because a zawj is just one of a couple. It doesn't mean male or female. And when Allah talks of spouses in that sense, or companions in that sense, it refers for a husband would be a wife, and for a wife it would be a husband, you know, in that sense.
That's not the general perception we're getting, because, I mean, lots of times everything is referred specifically for the benefit of the male. Maybe it's a misconception or a misunderstanding, or maybe we're misconstruing the understanding of the verses, that we're interpreting it as a masculine gender or everything leading to male. But the talk the lady gave the last time, she clearly emphasized that it should be spouses. You know, it doesn't specifically refer to a male, but it's specifically for spouses.
Yeah. So I think it's like I was mentioning, is that it's because, I mean, like, you know, it'll be quite complex to make the Quran every time say men and women, it becomes like monotonous. So I think it's because it's written from a male sense that it implies the female, but the reverse is also true. But I see Abdul Qadir Abdul Samad got his hand up. So maybe also you can unmute him, or Sari can unmute him, and Abdul Qadir can give a comment.
Assalamu alaikum. See, what I believe is that if you look at chapter 2, verse 25, where Allah tells us, Abashiril lazina amanu wa amilu salihat, give glad tidings to those who have believed and have acted righteously, anna lahum jannatin tajri min tahtiha anhar. But what is very, very important is, kullama rizqu minha min samaratin, whenever they are given sustenance, they alu haza allazi ruzikna min qabl. They are going to look at things in the hereafter and compare it with this world. That we all these things we had, like for instance, discussing this question about mates and this thing, you see. But Allah makes it very, very clear when He says, wa utu bihi mutashabihan. They are given things in similarities. You see? And then Allah says, وَلَهُمْ فِيهَا أَزْوَاجُ مُطَهَّرَةٌ. And in them is going to be أَزْوَاجُ مُطَهَّرَةٌ, meaning purified companions. So we got to understand in the hereafter, we got to understand in an allegorical way, which is very important. Like as he says, وَأُتُوا بِهِ مُتَشَابِهًا, that Allah is giving these things to us as what you call as a mutashabihat. And you must remember, if you look at chapter 40, verse 40, Allah says, Man amila salihan min zakarin aw insa. Whoever does good, irrespective whether you are a male or a female, walahum, you're going to have your reward. You follow? So Allah in the hereafter does not discriminate on the basis of gender. If you read that, you find the Quran is very clear on that.
Hello?
Jazakallah, can you move on?
See, just before you move on, you know the verses that can I carry on, or you'll come back to me?
Can I come back to you and see who else is hands up, right?
Okay.
Jazakallah. Right. Qasim.
No questions. Jazakallah, thanks.
Jazakallah. Qasim, the brain's hand is up.
Assalamu alaikum. Just a question, is a question and a comment. Is our gender not limited to this earth, to our bodies? Do our souls have gender? And then secondly, imagine for a moment that the Quran had to be completely gender equal in a male-dominated society, and how that would be digested. So I think it was in wisdom that Allah, maybe, Allah knows best, it was in wisdom that Allah slowly would speak to the man, make it more male-dominant, but also introduce the verses like previously mentioned about the similarities, etc., etc. And what's also not brought to light often is that if we look at the Prophet ﷺ's wife, Khadija, radiallahu anha, she was his supporter. First of all, she was older than him. So she was obviously had more world knowledge. She was a businesswoman. So she was financially savvy. She gave instructions to her workers. She was his comforter, his supporter, his financier. She was pivotal in his success as to support his role in his mission. So yeah, that's just some thought that I had commented to that.
Thanks, Qasim. I think that was a good point. I think the example of Khadija is actually a very relevant example coming to the topic on financial transactions. And I think that's why for me, when I was looking at this verse around, the forgetful part, the verse doesn't talk of forgetting. And even that the dilla is not a negative connotation. Even in Surah Duha, Allah talks of the Prophet was wandering. And I think also we must also appreciate that women have very special skills as well. And they have very emotional connection. They think of many things that men don't often consider. And that can sometimes be in a court situation, sometimes second person might help them, guide them through the process, and they need that support. So I think the principle behind this is not about their weaknesses, but actually compensating for their strengths. If I put it that way, because they have a very emotional connection with things, but also could provide a lot more detail to a factual question, because they might bring other dimensions to this issue, and you just want to know X or Y, right? And I think that's part of the issue there. But specifically to your question, So whether there'll be gender differences in the hereafter. So if you look at Surah 13, verse 23, Allah Subhanahu says, guardians of perpetual bliss, they shall enter there, as well as the righteous among their fathers, their spouses, and their offspring. And angels shall enter upon them from every gate. So it does seem to have some kind of family structure. But I agree with Abdul Karim Samad. I mean, it'll be in similarity. So, I mean, rivers of milk and honey, or, the fruits, but they won't be exactly the same. And I think also the gender part would be something special. But it does seem to suggest that there would be something similar to a structure of communion, like a communal existence with people.
Okay, Jazakallah. Yasin, Najib, can you move on?
Yeah.
Right. Ahmed, Sani, any question?
No questions.
Okay, Jazakallah. Sani?
Assalamu alaikum. No questions.
Okay. Banza?
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
I just want some clarity, man, on the verse of Bibi Aisha, How do we come to know that it was talking about her in the Quran?
Okay, Nazir?
Slightly off topic.
See how quickly I refer to you there.
Yeah, you're right. There's no mention of the word Aisha there. You're correct. I mean, it's based on history. But I think it's just sometimes easier, like the example I gave, call her Maryam and call her Aisha. It's just simpler to communicate it in that way. But you're right, there's no mention of Aisha as such. And yeah.
Okay, because I mean, you and the people of the cave, I mean, there were no names to say it was a certain person and a certain, So I don't know. But Jazakallah, thanks.
Yeah, no, your point is valid.
Shukran. Salam.
Jazakallah. Aziz? Aziz? Can I ask you to unmute?
I'm saying, Assalamu alaikum. I got no questions. You know that I'm a bit of a sick man at the moment. So alhamdulillah, just came to listen to you guys. All right.
Are you doing okay?
Yeah, man. You walk around thinking you got sprained your leg, and for 1 week you think you sprained your leg, and then suddenly you realize you got a fracture and not a sprain.
Oh my God.
And then you pay the price for being idiotic,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's move on. Right. Kasim, I covered you. Kasim Farba, I covered you. Farah, I covered you. Farana, I covered you. Farana is Gulam there. Does he have a question?
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. At least Farana is allowing me to share a phone.
Jazakallah. I just want to know something, Nazir. If you look at Allah has created men and women. But if you look at women, Allah has created them weaker than men. Isn't that can lead to gender violence? Because Allah has created them weaker, men are abusing women. So what response do we give to people, say on the street, if they ask me a question like this one? Because you see, the man is created, woman is created weaker than men, so men can physically, right? So men can abuse women physically. So what response do we give to people on the street? If they were to tell me Allah created men stronger.
Yeah. I'm actually just wondering of the opposite. If men had to be bringing up children, what the society would look like.
Yeah.
It's
a good thing, right? But what response? That's a good example. But I think we got to give an answer, a clear answer to the guys around.
Yeah, but I suppose, it's the same thing of like,
Right.
There has to be diversity and complementarity, right?
Okay.
If the whole world was only females or the whole world was only males, that in itself creates imbalance. And the second question, even if you look at within males, you get very strong males and weak males. Among females, you find the same thing. So I don't think it's an issue of male, female, an excuse for violence, right? Violence is a criminal behavior. And it's not only related to, so gender does,
See, violence can be a criminal, this thing, but the guy becomes criminal because he takes advantage of the woman. It's not maybe criminal in its sense. It could just be just because he takes advantage of the weakness.
Yeah, but we must also appreciate that. So when
There is a level of criminality, I agree, but
Yeah.
it's not total.
So you're right. There's always there's a power play, right? And you're
Right.
right. There's obviously when if you have an advantage, then the opportunity for abuse does exist. But one other thing to also appreciate is a lot of the domestic violence is often associated with alcohol and drugs. So that's actually the biggest issue.
Right. That is one distinct, but if you look at it the other way around, in the Muslim environment, for example, because the so-called Islam that we have around encourages that men must be encourages the abuse of women. Let's put it that way, rather.
Yeah, actually,
So it's not only the alcohol that leads to it, but it's also the religious factions and the beliefs that they come with,
Yeah, so you're touching on Surah 4, verse 34, right?
and the cultures as well. You see.
Yeah. So I think that's an important issue you're raising. So and to some degree, it does sort of carry forward from misinterpretation of. So I actually purposely didn't discuss Surah 4, verse 34 in this topic,
Right.
this halqa, because it'll just take a lot longer.
Okay.
But it's the verse about Ar-Rijalu Qawwamuna 'ala Nisa, and it goes on because Allah has favored the one upon the other. But Allah doesn't say favor, we qualifies it because of what He gives of His amwal. So it's not a justification of power in terms of physical strength, but it's actually, I think one of the translators puts it nicely. It says, men are the supporters of women. And when you read the totality of that verse, it's very clear that it's actually referring to men as being supporters of women because of what Allah has provided them, for which they share and provide the support of women. So it doesn't have anything to do with gender. So that's the one component. Then the second is the continuation of that verse, which talks of, if there's, if you fear, I forget what the Arabic word now, but when you fear, what's that? So the same Arabic word is used in Surah 4, verse 34, and the exact word is used, I think, in 4:128, where women fear the same.
Wallati takhafuna nushuzahunna.
Nushuz, that's exactly, I think. So if there's a fear of nushuz, and you find later on in the same surah, here it's where the male fears nushuz from the woman, and the later verses it talks of where the woman fears nushuz from the men. So that's the first thing to appreciate. But specifically to your issue about abuse, there's three components mentioned there, and one of them talks of daraba. And I think we dealt with this topic endlessly. But
I think that one we can.
I don't end up. I won't do justice to it, but just to point out that daraba in that context does not mean to hit.
Right.
I think it just means to separate, and actively engage and separate. So, but let's not go down that path. But you're right in a sense that if it's justified on a Quranic or a Islamic basis, that is wrong and not allowed. Yeah.
No problem. Jazakallah, Nazir.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalam. Jazakallah.
Dinky, Nasir Ismail. It must be Dinky, right?
Sorry, I'm just. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Begin your
Sorry,
motion.
man. I've been battling with this Zoom app for a while now. I think I finally got it right. I joined in the halqa very late, so I didn't get the gist of the discussion. But inshallah, next week I might have a few questions to ask for some contribution to me. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, let's move on. Nazir Khan, I'm going to ask you to unmute. There you go.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Just a comment and probably a question as well. In this time and age, and especially I think with our Indian background of Islamic practice, we find that at the time of marriage and particularly proposal and things like that, we find that men are doing the proposing, whereas equally women have the right to propose as well. We don't see that practice. That's number one. Number two, we find that especially at the time of nikah, marriage, lots of time women are not present for the nikahs, or used to be the custom, where you find they stay at home and the representative will be asked, has she given permission to carry on with the nikah? So why is it that we don't have a woman present and they can express themselves yes or nay towards marriage? So in a way it's a question, in a way it's a comment. I don't know if somebody can clarify for us. But Quran doesn't mention anything like that at all. That men should be the one taking the step.
Yeah, so you're very right. I mean, the Quran is very neutral on that point and almost like futuristic in its stance. So it doesn't even give any of that detail and keeps it very open for the contractual agreements to be worked out as individuals wish. Your point about our Indian baggage and specifically the presence of a female at the nikah, because we have a convoluted process that you've got to have two men to go and ask the woman, and then they must come and represent. She can't come and represent. And then there's a fiqh law about whether she's a divorced woman or a non-divorced woman, and then but it's absolute. I think the solution is the Atlantic Ocean, because it's strange that all the Maulanas, when they cross the Atlantic Ocean to go to the US, they have no issue with having the bride next. Even Indians in the US, I mean, men and women would be in the mosque together and they'd say yes, whatever it is. So I don't know, it means something with the Atlantic Ocean that seems to cure this problem. But it's baggage, to be honest. There's no Quranic justification for it.
Yeah, I think the women must start asking for a change also, and say we want to be present at the nikah. And the more the women do that, it makes it become a new practice, like it's done worldwide. So yeah, sometimes we need to look inside also, say, maybe we just contributing to this situation. But very good point, Nazir. I
believe if you look at history, Bibi Khadija, I think, proposed to the Prophet ﷺ and wanted him to be a husband when she learned how honest he was with handling her trade, etc. So I think this is the example that we've got to follow, and that women do the proposing also sometimes.
Yeah, it's very much by choice. So they just must be empowered. If they want to propose, they have the right to. Okay, can we move on? I propose we move on. That's an interesting question, comments. Okay, so done there. Rafiq, you ready for any question, comment?
Assalamu alaikum. How are you, Nazir?
Walaikum salam.
How are you, Nazir?
Alhamdulillah, good.
I just wanted to know why are women often addressed in an indirect way in the Quran? Except for Bibi Maryam, why does Allah say the wife of Pharaoh, or the wife of Nuh? So, for example, when he addresses Fir'aun, he'll say, "O Pharaoh," or "O Nuh." But why are their spouses not addressed by their names? Then can we conclude then that men are addressed directly much more than women in the Quran. So for example, if you take 423, when all the categories for prohibition for marriage are given, then men is addressed. It doesn't say like to women, these are the categories you can't marry, but a man is told which categories he can't marry. So if you can just comment on that.
All right, good question. So I'm wondering, I mean, so when I think of the wife of Pharaoh, I almost think that's more like an epithet, because Pharaoh is this iconic character, and there I think it's more for emphasis, as I would see. I mean, the other verse that says, "Ya Maryam," you know. But you're right, in other circumstances, "Ya Ukhta Harun," you know. There's always this kind of association. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I mean, whether there's a subtle message in that, or is it just because of the context in which the Quran was revealed? Because I think we also need to appreciate that, right? Is that if the Quran had to speak in a feminine gender throughout and make the feminine gender the primary gender, the Quraysh might not even have listened to the Quran, right? Because they were burning the females alive. So I mean, I think there is a definite sort of, seems to be a differentiation between males and females in the Quran, and specifically in terms of their roles as well. You know, I think a mother and a father are fairly distinct. Your and your father are quite distinctly separated. But I don't know if anyone else, or if Ossi's got another, or Sheikh Abdul Qadir, or anyone else has another comment on that. It's a good question.
Raja, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, look, I mean, it obviously, it was a patriarchal society, right? And that's and even today, it's actually a patriarchal society. I mean, even in Europe, it's still fairly patriarchal. I mean, men get paid more than women. It's just a fact of life.
Yeah, I mean, I think also a debate is how was the society structured at the time when the Quran was revealed, and so the Quran would rather lay down new rules instead of changing its grammatical structure or the use of words. For example, people corrupted the Salah. Salah doesn't change the word Salah; it just corrects the perception. People were burying girls alive, so he just corrects that practice, but he continues with the grammatical use of the way he addresses people, because that the message must sink through. That's more important. So I really don't think anything turns on the fact that the address is made like the wife of Adam or the wife of Noah, etc. It's very interesting that they use of language, but certainly I don't think it can formulate any concrete structures of society, based on that. In other words, the role of women, etc. I don't think anything can be said based on the way the Quran addresses in terms of its grammatical use, because those rules are clearly laid down in the Quran as to what the rights of men are, what the rights of women are, and what each can and can't do.
Sheikh Abdul Qadir has got his hand up.
What I would say, Assalamu alaikum. Brother Nazir, I must compliment you on the explanation of chapter 2, verse 282. That was, alhamdulillah, very well done. You have thrown a new light on that particular, as far as what to zillu ahdahuma, what to zakiru ahdahuma. And we must understand a lot of this so-called discrimination is got to do with the Arabic language. You see, that language, Arabic language does not have a common gender, neither does it have a neuter gender. So when Allah, for instance, He talks about Ya ayyuhal lazina amanu, for instance, kutiba alaykumus siyam, right? Siyam has been prescribed for you. We understand it to be a common gender applying to both male and female, right? Now, if you look at other parts, for instance, when Allah talks about Ya ayyuhan nas, I mean, oh people, follow. So I think this business of where the male and the female, we might look at it, but like for instance, even in the Hebrew language, right? You see the Lord's Prayer starts with Our Father. You see, so it's got a lot to do with grammar, not to say, but I know there are certain places, for instance, Allah has specifically mentioned female, like if you look at chapter 24, verse 2, Allah mentions Az-zaniyatu waz-zani, the adulteress and the adulterer, where He has made a distinction. In the same way, if you look at 81, right, where Allah protects a female child even before the child is born. وَإِذَا الْمَوُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. You find specifically where it deals with women, Allah brings it a feminine gender. And then same way, if you look at chapter 24, verse 2, right? Chapter 24, verse 4, where Allah talks about those who, for instance, وَالَّذِينَ يَرْمُونَ الْمُحْصَنَاتِ, right, where it specifically deals with female, but otherwise, I mean, as far as we are concerned, where like we said, وَالْقَانِتَاتُ وَالْقَانِتَاتُ وَالصَّالِحَاتُ وَالصَّالِحَاتُ, where Allah mentions both. But because of the Arabic language, more than anything else, Allah has to say that He gives the masculine example, but it does not necessarily mean it is masculine, or it is Allah is trying to favor the masculine gender, not at all.
Okay, Jazakallah. Yeah. Sadia, any comments from you on there?
No, I'm just asking this because most women, some Muslim as well as non-Muslim, they claim that the Quran has like the tone of the Quran has a male bias. But I understand, appreciate what Abdul Samad is saying, is that you have to look at it in terms of the Arabic pronoun. Because if we just read the translations, then it's very easy to deduce from the translations.
Sorry, I think you're breaking up. Hello?
I can still hear you, but we've lost.
We lost Sadia, right?
Yeah, I don't see her. I see Rafiq still there.
Okay, let's move on and we come back to Sadia when she's back, right? Yunus?
Assalam, Nazir.
Assalam.
Nazir, you know, there's so many verses in the Quran that stress on the importance of gender equality, right? And I just wanted your opinion. If you look at the Muslim countries, you know, for example, Egypt or Saudi Arabia, or in Asia, you look at Pakistan, India, and in fact, Pakistan mainly. I won't say India is a Muslim majority country. All these Muslim majority countries where women are treated as second-class citizens, even though the Quran stresses on the importance of gender equality. What would you attribute this to? You know, because there's a consistent pattern, mainly in Muslim countries, also in Africa, you know, where in spite of the Quran's verses stressing on this importance of gender equality, women are still treated very badly, and they like marginalized. They treated almost as second-class citizens. So, what would you say is the reason for this?
Sure. I think to a large extent, it's really cultural. So a lot of I think it's what's interesting is like if you think of a country like Malaysia.
Why couldn't they give her a name?
It's the compared to like a country like Pakistan. The role of women is a bit more advanced in Malaysia, for example, at least in the modern era, compared to where Pakistan is. And I think one is culture and the second is leadership. And when I think of like, I think Malaysia might have been in the same situation as Pakistan was in the past, until sort of Quranic knowledge. And I think was it Mahathir, Muhammad Mahathir, I think he sort of came with a fairly like a more open Quranic kind of thinking and opened that society and unleashed the potential of women in that society. And if you look at today, I mean, there's the Malaysian women are like doctors, they quite advanced, they contribute to large parts of the Malaysian society and economy. But I think it's sort of unlocking that mind to break that lock, and because people associate that culture with Islam. And if you want to be a good Muslim, then you're actually being a good culturalist, you're not being a good Muslim. And I think a lot of that is sort of rooted in that. But you see the same thing also in like Saudi Arabia, I mean, probably even worse than Pakistan, right? Classic. And I think it really stems from ancient culture. The Quran came to remove us from that, and then people have locked back into that ancient culture.
So, I mean, people are placing more importance on the culture and ignoring the the Quran, the injunctions in the Quran.
Yeah, and the thing is, you go to like Western society, it's like the opposite, right? It becomes so modernized that women don't see their role as mothers. That's like secondary or even tertiary sometimes. So I think the Quran provides a very good balance. Is that it doesn't say women can't be leaders, but it also places certain emphasis, gives them rights, creates a fairly balanced approach. And I think that we kind of stuck in these two extremes, to be honest. But the Quran, if we follow the Quran, we'd probably be far ahead. At least Sumayya's got a hand up. Sumayya,
Yeah, can you unmute yourself? You can go for it.
I think more than just culture within our religion, there's far too much like secondary sources that sort of support the incorrect view or narrative that women are inferior or that allow such injustice to occur.
Sumayya, you're very correct there. I mean, you're right. I mean, if you just look at some of the narrations related to women in secondary sources, it's really, really bad.
It's frightening.
Yeah. No, that is very true.
And also just to something I think worth mentioning, in response to Uncle Nazir's comment about women proposing, I think the example of Musa alayhi salam and the daughter of Shu'aib, isn't it inferred that the proposal sort of came from her side?
Very good one. You're right. It is. Yeah. She told her father, and then the arrangement was done. So actually, there's more evidence for women proposing than men proposing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
That's a very good point.
Okay, Jazakallah. So I see Sheikh Samad, and Anwar and Rehan, right? So let me go to Rehan first, because he asked me first about his second comment. But before I do that, I think Sadia was still busy with her point. Sadia, you want to finish your point and then I move to Dr. Ray?
No, it's okay. We can drop that one. I was just thinking about the point that Ghulam raised relating to violence against women. I think perhaps he raised it because that's really an issue in South Africa. In fact, Cyril himself said that there's two battles, the battle against COVID and the battle and the one against the violence against women. So that's why I disagree with it being just a criminal issue. I think it does have something to do with gender, as Ghulam was insinuating. Because why? Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Because currently this is quite an issue in South Africa. So why isn't the issue the other way around? Why isn't the problem the other way around? If it was a criminal issue, then why is it the violence against women that's become a current battle?
Yeah, I think there's also the underlying factors that drive it. And I think Ghulam is right in the sense that obviously the power factor plays a big role. But also, and I think related also to Mia's point is the dehumanizing attribution to women. You know, it actually lowers their value. And I think that's an important factor. And once you view someone, so it could be a gender issue, but even if you look at poor people, because they lowered value in society, they're more likely to be ill-treated. And the same thing with women, they valued less than men. And that is, I think, a big issue. And that is true. And Sumaya pointed out, I mean, it's actually even from our own Islamic secondary sources that emanates as well. So that's very true.
Okay,
So so it's not related to physical strength.
Yeah, but I still believe that we should see it as criminality. So there are underlying factors of values and other things, but a person that abuses a woman it's a crime, and I don't think it's you know, we should regard these as criminals that behave in this way, right? That was what I was trying to get at. It's inhumane, and that's why I call it a criminal behavior. But you're very right that the underlying factors are probably what drives a lot of this.
So it's physical strength and mental weakness.
Thank you.
I think you must, you know what you must bear in mind. It's physical strength and mental weakness. It's like any bully you get. You just take advantage of someone who's physically, you know, weaker than them. And it's really a process of sort of education. And the first people need to be educated is our scholars to try and get the message to people that this is unacceptable behavior. Okay, Dr. Ray, Sadia, we okay? Can you move on? Okay, Ray. Dr. Ryan, you there? No, I think it's gone. Okay, Sheikh.
Assalamu alaikum. I want Brother Nazir to comment on two very important things that I feel is an influence here. First of all, the concept of Aqiqah. See, we as Muslims, why is it that we have emphasized it's in the Hadith and the Prophet has done it, and without exception, when a male child is born, we slaughter two. When a female child is born, we slaughter one. isn't that also an impact, something that influences the male to say that he is greater because, he's got, at the time of childbirth, right from the very beginning, we are actually instilling this idea into our males that, you know what, you are greater, you are more important to me, therefore I had to slaughter too. And yet, that's one point. The second thing, what I want to know is, like, for instance, you saw about chapter 4, verse 34. But I make a difference, and I want you to comment on this, between nushuz and shikak. You see, nushuz is not to be used at all times. It's special case, right, where you find like infidelity or something. But generally, Allah says about in chapter 4, verse 35, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ شِقَاقَ بَيْنِهِمَا, that if you find anything that sours the relationship, right, then where you find the man and the woman is given equal opportunity, that one representative from his side and one from her side. But more so, I want you to comment the influence of the Akika on us as males.
Yeah, I never thought about that one as well. So you're right, it starts from birth where we have such differences. And I mean, it's again, all the Akika, it emanates from like pre the Prophet. I mean, it's like an Arabian tradition, right? The Quran doesn't talk of Akika per se, and you're right, it just carries forward that same patriarchal mentality. We just replicate it now. So we should do equality from birth, I agree.
Okay, can we move on? Uncle Anwar?
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Nazir, you know what? Allah in His infinite mercy created Adam alayhi salam before Eve. So Allah was not biased. He did that in His own wisdom. That's why I feel when Allah addresses men directly in the Quran, He has placed a greater responsibility on him, and He has created him before the woman, That was my comment. Jazakallah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you look at the overall, there is a certain responsibility that men have, which you're right. I mean, Surah 4 verse 34 does talk of that advantage that men have, and that is the way Allah has structured society, basically. Yeah.
Jazakallah, thanks.
Okay, so we're done there. Sumaya, I see your hand is up. You got another comment?
Sorry, no more comments. Thank you.
Okay, Jazakallah. Then I think we've covered everyone. If there is anyone else with a comment or question, unmute yourself, raise your hand, and please ask it, because I'd like to then close. Nope. Okay. Then that's all for tonight. Nazir, Jazakallah for the halqa and the short notice and preparing it. I'm sure you all enjoyed it. Certainly me. So until next week, inshallah. Jazakallah for your participation, everyone. We'll see you next week, same time, same place. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.